Cyril Ramaphosa has now arrived in India ahead of the start of the G20 summit meeting this weekend. Food security, energy and climate action will feature on the agenda of the discussions there. The presidency says that South Africa will be hoping to negotiate the best possible outcomes for the country and other developing nations. South Africa will assume the G20 presidency only in 2025. Meanwhile, the leaders of Russia and China will not be gathering with others in New Delhi this weekend. They're in fact sending representatives instead. For more on this, let's speak to political and economic risk analyst Marisa Lourenço. A very good evening to you, Marisa. Welcome back to News at Prime. So let's talk about the absence of Presidents Xi and Putin. How significant is that, and how should we read that?
It is fairly significant because it does lay bare the tensions that do exist between China and India. And this is especially pertinent if we consider that the BRICS summit has just happened and that it would be much better if these two powers could actually cooperate. The absence of Russia as well just shows how much the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict continues to cast a shadow over global affairs. And I think if we look at the summit, these two absences are going to take away from some of the other debates that are going to need to be happening, especially for Africa and especially on the possible inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member.
How much of an obstacle, though, will it be when you consider that even the Americans, who wield significant power in the global or on the global stage, have said that they would too want to see the inclusion of Africa, or the AU, in fact, in the G20. India as well has raised a similar sentiment. So does the absence of China and Russia mean that that cannot happen necessarily?
So I think what we're seeing right now is that it's looking quite good for the AU to become a permanent member, but there's always a chance that the G20 is not going to reach consensus on this. And ideally what you would want is two of the world's largest economies, China and Russia, to be there, to be present, because both of these governments have actually said that they are friends to Africa, and they have said separately on separate occasions that they would support the AU becoming a permanent member. So for Africa and for the AU, I think that it would have been better if they were there. I think also for South Africa, it would want Russian or stronger Russian representation. Obviously, that's complicated with the ICC warrant out, but because food insecurity is high on South Africa's agenda, and because a lot of the food insecurity at the moment is caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it would be better if the summit actually sort of had everyone at the table so that it could really hash things out and put down some achievable outcomes.
And on achievable outcomes, Africa expects a lot, because the sentiment on the continent is that it's time that it's taken seriously and is treated as an equal, especially by the wealthy nations who have often just looked at it as a destination where they send in aid and then exact whatever they want given their positions at a particular time. The West is facing significant challenge when you look at its position on the continent. Just now there's the rising anti-French sentiment in parts of the continent where we've seen coups recently, right? If the AU does get this G20 membership, how does the continent make the best of that to make sure that the playing field is evened and that we're not just dismissed as a continent, really, by the others?
Well, it's a very important first step, especially, for the world to be able to talk to Africa rather than about Africa. South Africa is, since 1999 has been the only permanent African member of the G20, and that's obviously not sufficient representation when you consider how vast and how diverse the continent of Africa is. So I think it's a very important first step. What is going to be tricky if this does become a reality, if the AU does join, is the AU trying to coordinate more unified responses and trying to get all of its member states to agree on some of the key issues that it needs to focus on. The AU is, of course, a very important organizational body, but it does represent so many interests, and we have seen at times that it has not been able to effectively kind of represent all of the interests on the African continent effectively. I mean, at the moment, because the G20 is, made up of the world's strongest economies, the AU is the best chance of Africa getting representation on that forum, but it's not a perfect way forward. It's going to need to establish some types of mechanisms in order to be able to identify what are key issues that are applicable to most of its member states and how can it actually encourage fruitful debate. I'm not sure if the AU has a way for this yet, but it's definitely something that is going to be important for it to consider going forward.
And is there really strength in numbers for Africa when you consider that even South Africa has had to fend off pressure, if you will, to choose a side between Russia and the West, especially in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And Pretoria has repeatedly had to say that, well, it's choosing to be non-aligned and will not be bullied, to use a word from Minister Lady Pandor, into taking any position.
I do think there's strength in numbers, and I think actually the fact that the AU is, there's the talk of the AU actually joining the G20 as a permanent member, the fact that it's actually reaching, that it could possibly become a reality, shows that the West in particular, in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's really had to realize that it cannot dictate terms to African countries as much as it would like. We did see that it did seem quite shocked that most African countries chose to remain neutral in the UN General Assembly votes on Russia-Ukraine. And I think that it is coming to that realization. So definitely there has been strength in numbers, although I wouldn't say that this has been a unified African stance. I think that African governments have just taken this decision. Most African governments have taken this decision on their own. They have realized that, it's not the Cold War anymore. They don't necessarily have to choose a side. And I think that this has worked well for them. It is showing that African countries are not able to be dictated to, and that they can actually set a tone in global affairs, which many of them have actually shown a willingness to when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, and they've really expressed their displeasure at the impact it's having on food insecurity and other issues.
And what about, Marisa, then, the support for the inclusion of the AU in the G20? Is it a free meal? All of these countries who are speaking in favor of that position, including the Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, are they doing it out of pure goodwill, or do they want something as well from the continent? What's in it for them?
Yeah, I mean, nothing in politics ever happens out of sheer goodwill, unfortunately. Definitely Africa is a very important ally to a lot of these powers because the continent, again, it represents a lot of diverse interests. It's got a lot of resources. It's just a very important, it's just important to have African leaders on your side. So effectively, these governments are trying to show that, they can be friends to Africa. It helps them then invest in African countries. It helps them to extract resources. And this is of relevance, for the US, getting critical minerals. Same with China. It's relevant for Russia, which is the main arms supplier to African countries at present.